The night was thick with anticipation, the kind of stillness that only arrives before the storm. At Northfield, the renowned Kentucky racetrack, the air was buzzing with energy. It was the final stretch of the prestigious competition, the crowd's excitement at a fever pitch. All eyes were on Midnight, the racehorse once hailed as the future of the sport. But tonight, something was off. Midnight's legs faltered, his body collapsing beneath him like a broken puppet. Gasps echoed through the stands. In an instant, the once celebrated athlete was reduced to a helpless heap of muscle and bone. Richard Calloway, the cold and calculating owner of Midnight, stood motionless at the edge of the track. His gaze was as steely as the expensive suit he wore, and in that moment, he didn't flinch. The horse was no longer a champion. It was simply a piece of property, an asset to be discarded once its usefulness had expired. His eyes locked on the ground as the crowd erupted in panic, his indifference so palpable that it was almost suffocating. Richard didn't need to say a word. With a subtle nod, he signaled the end of Midnight's racing career. The crowd was still buzzing, but Richard was already moving on, calculating his next move, as though Midnight's fall was nothing more than an inconvenience. In the midst of the chaos, a lone figure stepped forward. Ashley, a young and passionate veterinarian, stood frozen. She wasn't like the rest of the spectators. Where they saw a fallen horse, she saw a living being in desperate need of help. She'd always known the ugly side of the sport, how quickly an athlete could be discarded once the thrill of victory faded, but something about Midnight's pain hit her harder than she expected. The others shuffled away, already forgetting the horse that had brought them such excitement, but not Ashley. She saw the fractured leg, the helpless eyes. She felt the pulse of desperation and knew this could be her one chance to make a difference. Her heart raced as she stood there, frozen in the face of an impossible choice. She knew the risks. Helping Midnight could ruin her career. Richard Calloway's influence was enough to erase anyone who stood in his way. But if she did nothing, Midnight would be abandoned, left to suffer, forgotten like so many others. The moral dilemma clenched at her chest like a vice. Her decision would change everything, not just for Midnight, but for her own life. The camera lingered on Midnight's face as he lay there, struggling to rise, his breath shallow. The pain was evident in his eyes, a silent plea for help. And Ashley was his only chance. As she stepped forward, her boots crunching against the gravel, Ashley hesitated, caught between the weight of the world and the overwhelming urge to do something. Would she make the choice to save him? Or would she walk away, keeping her career intact at the cost of Midnight's life? The camera zoomed in on her face, capturing the internal struggle in her eyes as the tension thickened, leaving the audience wondering just what she would do next. Ashley didn't have time to waste. The decision that loomed before her, heavy as a lead weight, had to be made in an instant. Her training kicked in as she moved quickly to Midnight's side. Her hands trembled. Only slightly. She couldn't afford to let fear seep in now. The horse's leg was clearly broken, the injury severe, but it wasn't the end. She had seen worse. Still, the odds were against her. Midnight was a thoroughbred, a prized asset to Richard Calloway, and the people around her were only too aware of it. If Richard knew she was getting involved, he would never let her live it down. The small, tight-knit town had already learned to bow to his will. If Ashley stood up to him now, she risked more than just her career. She risked everything. But as Midnight's chest heaved with strained breaths, something deep within her stirred. She couldn't walk away. Not when the horse was still alive. Not when she knew that beneath the pain there was a strength waiting to emerge. She looked around, assessing the situation, knowing the clock was ticking. The crowd had scattered, but the tracks were still buzzing with the sound of hooves and tires. She needed help. She needed to move fast, but she also needed to be discreet. Pulling out her phone, Ashley quickly dialed her closest colleagues. a couple of trusted veterinarians who had seen her fight for animals in the past. The response wasn't what she hoped. "Ashley, you're crazy. Richard's not the kind of man you defy," one of them warned, but Ashley wasn't backing down. Her mind raced through her options. She needed to stabilize Midnight, get him off the track and out of sight. But the dangers were already mounting. She was alone, and Richard Calloway wasn't a man who took no for an answer. As she worked quickly to bandage the leg, the first obstacle reared its head. Richard's men appeared like vultures, circling the track as they came into view. Ashley barely had time to register their presence before one of them, a towering figure named Frank, approached. "That horse is Richard's property," Frank said, his voice low but dripping with threat. "Step away." His words were a clear warning. Ashley wasn't going to have an easy time of this. Ashley's heart raced as she shot him a glare, but she kept her voice steady. "You think I'm just going to stand by and watch him suffer? I'm trying to help him." But even as she spoke, her voice wavered. She knew it was pointless to argue with them. Richard had money, power, and influence, and none of that was in Ashley's favor. The weight of the situation bore down on her. She was not just battling Richard's men, she was fighting an entire system that saw animals like Midnight as commodities, to be used and discarded when they were no longer profitable. Still, she couldn't let Midnight go like this, not when he was so close to a full recovery. If only she could get him to her farm, out of their reach, she might have a chance. Her mind churned through the logistics, weighing each decision with precision. But she had no real resources, no team to back her up, no access to the expensive medical equipment Midnight would need to recover fully. All she had was the bond she felt with this horse, this creature who had been thrown away the moment he was no longer valuable. In the distance, she could see Richard's luxury car parked, a sharp contrast to the chaos surrounding Midnight. She could almost hear his voice, smooth and dismissive, telling her to stay out of his way. Richard didn't care about Midnight. He didn't care about the pain or the potential for something greater within the horse. To him, Midnight was simply a tool, a means to an end. It was a harsh truth, but one Ashley was forced to accept. But the more she looked at Midnight, the more her resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for a horse, she was fighting for something bigger. This was about more than a career. It was about the belief that every living being deserved respect, and Ashley wasn't about to let that go, no matter how hard the battle became. As Midnight's leg was wrapped and splintered, Ashley took a breath, looking up at the rising tension ahead. The hardest part was still to come. Ashley knew that the hardest part was yet to come. Midnight's injury was only the beginning. The horse had been through hell, and now it was her turn. With the leg wrapped as best as she could manage, Ashley stood back, eyes scanning the area. Richard's men were still lingering in the background, like sharks waiting for the right moment to strike. But it wasn't just Richard's lackeys she had to worry about now. The whole town had a hand in this, whether they realized it or not. Richard was their lifeline. His wealth and influence spread across every corner of Northfield, and crossing him was a dangerous game to play. Ashley glanced down at Midnight, whose large eyes were filled with a trust she couldn't bear to break. The horse seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his breathing slower now, as if sensing that someone finally cared. Midnight's strength was remarkable. Despite the pain, he stood tall, showing signs of resilience that gave Ashley hope. But every moment she spent there, the tension grew. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from one of her fellow veterinarians. "Ashley, you're walking into a hornet's nest. This is bigger than you." Her colleague was right. This wasn't just about Midnight anymore. It was about defying an entire system, one that treated animals as expendable. And the further Ashley pushed, the more she risked losing everything she had worked for. Her reputation, her career, maybe even her safety. Richard wasn't the type to let a small obstacle like Ashley stand in his way. He would take the horse back no matter the cost. The next few days were a blur of pressure, exhaustion, and an undercurrent of fear. Richard's team kept close tabs on Ashley, showing up unannounced at her practice, lurking around her property. The tension was suffocating. Midnight's leg was healing, but he was still weak, his body needing time to recover. It was in these quiet moments, however, that Ashley began to notice something remarkable. Midnight had an untapped potential, a skill that no one had ever bothered to nurture, a natural talent for jumping. It wasn't until she took him out to the paddock for some light exercises that she saw it. Midnight hesitated at first, unsure of the unfamiliar task, but when he finally leaped over a small obstacle with grace and power, Ashley's heart skipped a beat. She watched in awe as the horse's athleticism revealed itself in a way she hadn't expected. Midnight wasn't just a racehorse. He had the makings of something more, something extraordinary. But with that discovery came more complications. Richard wasn't the type to let such a discovery slip through his fingers. If he got wind of it, Midnight would become a pawn in a new game, a game Ashley wasn't prepared to lose. She couldn't afford to let anyone find out, especially not Richard. If he learned of Midnight's potential, the stakes would rise to a level she couldn't control. The walls were closing in around her. Richard's men were becoming more aggressive in their tactics. They showed up at her door, demanding Midnight's return. Legal threats were the least of her concerns now. Ashley's reputation in town was crumbling by the minute. People were whispering behind her back, calling her reckless, questioning her decisions. The small town she had called home was slowly turning against her, and Ashley was fighting an uphill battle against not just Richard's power, but public opinion. But there was no turning back now. The bond between Ashley and Midnight had deepened, and with every moment she spent caring for him, she became more convinced of his potential. She couldn't abandon him, not when he was showing signs of hope. Midnight wasn't just an injured racehorse anymore. He was her chance to prove that compassion could triumph over greed, that a life could be saved if you were willing to fight for it. The pressure mounted as Ashley struggled with every choice. Should she keep Midnight hidden away and risk him never reaching his full potential? Or should she stand up to Richard, exposing Midnight's abilities to the world? One thing was certain. Whatever decision she made, there was no easy way out, and as the days passed, it became more and more clear that Ashley's struggle wasn't just about Midnight. It was about fighting for what was right in a world where power and money often dictated who got to live and who got thrown away. The tension had reached its breaking point. Midnight was healing, his strength returning in surprising bursts. Ashley spent hours each day working with him, pushing him gently, guiding him through small jumps and simple exercises. She could see it now, the raw talent he had always possessed, hidden beneath layers of neglect and abandonment. But just as Midnight was showing real signs of recovery, danger loomed closer than ever. It was a quiet afternoon when it all came to a head. Ashley was working in the barn, tending to Midnight's care, when she heard the unmistakable sound of Richard's luxury car pulling into her driveway. She froze, heart hammering in her chest. There was no way to escape this. Richard wasn't just coming to check on Midnight, he was coming to take him back. He had made it clear that the horse was his property, and he had no intention of letting Ashley stand in his way any longer. Her mind raced. She had to act fast. Midnight was still in the paddock, his muscles looser than before, but his energy was building, his stamina returning. This was the moment. Ashley knew she couldn't let Richard take him now, not when she'd finally uncovered Midnight's true potential. She ran to the paddock, her breath coming in sharp bursts. The moment she reached midnight, she felt a flicker of panic, a sudden realization that she might not be able to save him after all. Richard and his men were close. They were just moments away from reclaiming what they saw as their property. The stakes had never been higher. As Richard's voice rang out from the driveway, demanding to speak with her, Ashley's pulse quickened. His men began to move toward the paddock, blocking her exit. She was cornered. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a brief moment she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. This wasn't just about midnight anymore. This was about her life. Without thinking, she turned to Midnight. "I know you can do this," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. She knew the risks. She knew what could happen if Midnight made a run for it, but there was no turning back. She reached for his reins, guiding him toward the fence. The moment felt like an eternity as she braced herself. Richard's men were closing in, and Ashley had only seconds to make a decision. Would she risk everything to protect Midnight, or would she let him be dragged back into the system that would use him and discard him when he was no longer of value? Suddenly Midnight bolted forward, his powerful legs propelling him with astonishing speed. The fence loomed ahead, and for a split second, Ashley's heart stopped. Was he going to make it? The fence was tall, imposing. She didn't know if Midnight had the strength to clear it. But then, as if sensing the danger, Midnight pushed harder, faster, and with an impossible burst of energy, leaped over the fence. Ashley watched in shock as Midnight soared through the air, his powerful form cutting through the night sky. She could hardly believe it. He had done it. He had escaped. But just as the dust settled, Richard's furious voice rang out from the other side of the fence. "Get him! Now!" His men scrambled toward the gap, but Midnight was already disappearing into the night, free, at least for now. Ashley stood frozen, watching helplessly as Midnight's form vanished into the darkness. She didn't know where he had gone or what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She had just lost Midnight, at least for the moment. And now, more than ever, the stakes were higher than she ever imagined. The camera lingered on. Ashley's face, the disbelief, the fear, the helplessness, all of it painted on her features. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she realized that Midnight was no longer in her grasp. The outcome of this battle was uncertain. The video cuts to black. The night stretched on endlessly. Ashley stood in the field, alone, her heart still pounding. In her chest, Midnight was gone, and with him, her last hope of keeping him safe. She didn't know where he'd gone or what would happen to him. She could feel the weight of her failure pressing down on her. She had tried to protect him, to give him a chance, but now she was left with nothing but the quiet, painful realization that she might never see him again. She spent the next few days searching for him, scouring the land around her farm, checking every nook and cranny, hoping for some sign. Her mind was a mess of doubt. Had she made the right choice? Should she have tried harder to hide Midnight to keep him from Richard's reach? But as the days passed and she found no trace of the horse, she began to lose hope. Richard's men were relentless. They scoured every inch of Northfield, and Ashley knew that it was only a matter of time before they found him. And then, just when she had almost given up, a phone call came through. It was one of her fellow veterinarians, his voice urgent and tight with tension. "Ashley, you need to come to the courthouse. Richard's pressing charges. He's trying to get Midnight back. Legally, we've got to do something now." Ashley felt a chill run through her. Richard was going to do whatever it took to take Midnight back, even if it meant dragging the horse through the legal system. He wasn't just trying to get what was rightfully his. He was punishing Ashley for her defiance. She didn't have time to waste. She couldn't just let Richard win. She rushed to the courthouse, her mind racing. Richard was a skilled businessman. He had the best lawyers, the best resources, and the most money. He would do everything in his power to make sure Midnight never had a chance. But Ashley had something Richard didn't: truth. She knew what Richard had done to Midnight, how he had deliberately injured the horse to end his career, to make him obsolete before he could even prove his worth. She had the proof, the evidence of Richard's cruelty. And now it was time to fight back. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Richard sat at the front, his usual icy composure on full display as he glared at Ashley. The judge called the proceedings to order, and the battle began. Ashley's lawyer presented the evidence, showing the medical records that proved Midnight's injuries were caused by intentional neglect. She detailed Richard's history of discarding animals once they had outlived their usefulness. Ashley's voice shook with emotion as she spoke, but she didn't back down. This was her moment. Midnight's fate, her own future. It all depended on the outcome of this trial. Richard's lawyers tried to discredit Ashley, painting her as an irresponsible veterinarian who had no right to interfere with the ownership of the horse. They claimed she had stolen Midnight, that her actions were reckless, and that she had no business keeping the horse under her care. But Ashley didn't flinch. She stood tall, her conviction burning bright. She wasn't just fighting for Midnight anymore. She was fighting for the truth. The tension in the room reached its peak as the judge deliberated. Minutes stretched into hours, and then, finally, the ruling came. Midnight is free, the judge declared. Richard Calloway is ordered to relinquish ownership of the horse. Ashley is granted full custody of Midnight. The courtroom erupted in shock and disbelief. Richard's face twisted in fury, but Ashley barely heard him. The only sound that mattered was the roaring of her heart, a feeling of victory so sweet it almost brought tears to her eyes. Midnight was free, the underdog had won. Ashley's victory was more than just legal. It was personal. She had stood up for what was right, and she had won, but it wasn't over. There was still work to be done. Midnight still needed time to heal, still needed someone to help him reach his full potential. But for the first time, in what felt like forever, Ashley felt hope. She had won the battle, and now, together with Midnight, she could move forward. Weeks later, Ashley and Midnight stood together at the starting line of a major competition. The world would soon see what they had been through, what they had overcome. As Midnight's hooves hit the ground, leaping over each obstacle with grace and power, Ashley's heart soared. This was the moment they had both been waiting for, the moment when Midnight's true potential was realized. The crowd cheered, but Ashley only had eyes for the horse. Midnight had proved Richard wrong. He had proved that he was more than just a racehorse. He was a fighter, a survivor, and together they had made it. The camera lingered on Ashley's face as she watched Midnight's victory. There was a tear in her eye, not of sadness, but of triumph. They had both fought for this moment, and now they had it. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ashley stood quietly in the field, the sun dipping below the horizon as Midnight grazed beside her. The world had changed, and so had she. The events that had unfolded over the past few months felt like a whirlwind, turbulent, unexpected, and yet deeply transformative. Midnight, once a broken racehorse abandoned to the whims of a cold-hearted owner, had become more than just a story of recovery. He had become a symbol, a living, breathing reminder that there was still hope, even when the odds were stacked against you. Ashley glanced at the horse, her heart swelling with pride. The bond they shared had been forged through struggle, through sacrifice, and through an unshakable belief in each other. In the beginning, it had been about saving Midnight, but along the way, she had discovered something deeper, something unexpected. She had saved herself, too. As the breeze swept across the field, Ashley's mind drifted back to that fateful night at Northfield, the night when everything had changed, the moment when Midnight collapsed on the track, and she had been forced to choose between doing what was right and following the path of least resistance. That decision had set everything in motion, leading her down a road filled with challenges. moral dilemmas, and danger. It had been terrifying at times, uncertain at others, but it had been worth every moment. Because Midnight had needed her, and in helping him, she had found the strength to stand up for something bigger than herself. Ashley's voice broke the silence, a soft whisper to the wind. "You taught me that anything is possible," she said, her words carrying a weight that only Midnight could understand. The horse nickered softly, nudging her arm as if in agreement. It was a small gesture, but to Ashley, it was everything. It was a sign that their journey together was just beginning. She thought back to the courtroom, the fight for Midnight's freedom, and the relief that had washed over her when the judge had ruled in her favor. That victory had been hard-earned, but it had meant something more than just a legal battle. It had been a victory for every animal that had ever been overlooked, abandoned, or treated as a mere commodity. It was a reminder that compassion could still prevail, that standing up for what was right could lead to real change. The sun had nearly set, casting long shadows across the pasture as Ashley stood with Midnight, the two of them connected by more than just a shared past. They had both endured hardship, but they had come out stronger on the other side. Midnight's incredible talent for jumping had been the key to their victory, but it was the bond they shared, the trust that had grown between them, that had truly carried them through. Ashley's gaze lingered on the horizon, her thoughts swirling. With gratitude, she had fought for Midnight, but in doing so, she had also fought for herself. She had learned that the greatest victories weren't always about winning a race or overcoming an obstacle. They were about staying true to your values, even when it felt like the world was against you. As the final rays of sunlight bathed the field in a golden glow, Ashley took a deep breath, letting the moment settle into her bones. The journey had been long, and the road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Ashley felt at peace. Midnight had given her a second chance, and in return, she had given him a life filled with love, care, and purpose. Together, they had proved that it was never too late to start over, to fight for something better. The camera slowly pulled away, capturing the image of Ashley and Midnight side by side, standing tall against the backdrop of the setting sun. It was a perfect picture of resilience, of love, and of the power of second chances. As the screen faded to black, Ashley's voice echoed one final time. "We both got a second chance, and I'll never forget what it took to get here." The words hung in the air, a powerful message of hope and perseverance. The journey that had begun with Midnight's fall at Northfield had led Ashley down a path she never could have predicted. What started as a simple decision to save a single life had transformed into something far greater. She had risked everything, the judgment of her peers, her career, and her safety, all for a horse no one else believed in. And now, standing at the crossroads of triumph and reflection, Ashley couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. Midnight's road to recovery hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks, moments when hope seemed out of reach, and the constant pressure of Richard's men watching from the shadows. Yet with each challenge, Ashley had grown stronger. The stakes had never been higher as she faced Richard's threats, the legal battles, and the moral dilemmas that came with every decision. But through it all, she had never faltered. The bond between Ashley and Midnight had been forged through their shared struggles, their determination, and, most importantly, their belief in each other. Midnight had been abandoned, a discarded tool, in the hands of a ruthless owner, but Ashley had seen the potential beneath the surface. She had seen something more than a racehorse. She had seen a fighter, and that fight was what had carried them both forward, giving them the strength to overcome every obstacle in their path. The courtroom victory had been the tipping point, the moment when everything came together. Midnight was free, not just from Richard's control, but from the system that had treated him like an object. And Ashley, too, had been freed from the fear, from the doubt and from the weight of a world that often didn't care about what was right. She had stood up, not just for Midnight, but for herself, and for every animal that deserved a second chance. Now, as Ashley watched Midnight soar through the air in victory, she knew that the journey had been worth it. It hadn't just been about saving a horse. It had been about proving that compassion, courage, and integrity could still make a difference in a world that often valued profit over everything else. As the camera panned over the crowd's roaring applause, Ashley stood at the edge of the field, watching Midnight take his final jump. The horse cleared the obstacle effortlessly, a picture of grace and power. It was a moment of pure triumph, a victory not just for Midnight, but for both of them. They had made it, against all odds, against all the forces that sought to tear them apart. Together, they had rewritten their story. Ashley's eyes glistened as she watched Midnight land softly on the other side, his muscles rippling beneath his coat. It wasn't just the competition that mattered, it was what this moment represented. This was a story of redemption, of second chances. It was proof that even the most broken things could be healed if given the right care, the right love, and the right chance to thrive. Turning her gaze towards the horizon, Ashley felt a deep sense of peace. The journey had been long and difficult, but the rewards were greater than she could have ever imagined. She had fought for Midnight because she believed in him, and in doing so, she had rediscovered something important. She believed in herself again, but the story wasn't over. It was a reminder that real change, real growth, only comes when we fight for what's right, when we refuse to give up, even when the world tells us it's not worth the struggle. Midnight's victory was just one piece of the larger puzzle, a puzzle that was still being completed day by day, with every choice Ashley made. The screen faded to black, but Ashley's voice remained steady and hopeful. You don't have to be someone's discard. You don't have to be forgotten. Fight for what matters, because the world needs more second chances. And with that, the message was clear. Compassion, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right could change everything. The journey may not be easy, but the rewards, both for the world and for yourself, are more than worth it.